The 6:15 bus to central New York was as routine as the setting sun. Commuters filled the seats, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their minds preoccupied with thoughts of dinner, bills, or perhaps nothing at all. Conversations hummed faintly in the background, broken only by the occasional hiss of the brakes. The air was warm, tinged with the scent of worn leather and faint traces of cologne. Near the front of the bus, Samuel Reed eased into his seat by the window. He was an unassuming figure, an elderly man with a thin, wiry frame, his dark skin lined with the marks of time. His hands rested on a wooden cane, its polished surface worn smooth from years of use. His clothes were plain but tidy, a navy jacket, neatly pressed slacks, and scuffed but polished shoes. Samuel had the look of a man who valued respect, both given and received. Most passengers hardly noticed him, their eyes sliding over him like water over stone. He blended into the scenery, a fixture of the everyday city life. Yet there was something about the way he sat, straight-backed, his head held high, that hinted at a life far more complex than the quiet dignity he now wore. 3 rows back, a group of teenagers boarded, their voices loud and filled with careless bravado. Brian, a lanky boy in a bright red hoodie, led the charge. His grin was sharp, his eyes scanning the bus for anything or anyone that might promise amusement. Spotting Samuel, his lips curled into a smirk. To him, the elderly man was the perfect target, silent, unassuming, and unlikely to fight back. He nudged his friends, whispering something that set off a chorus of muffled laughs. Brian's voice rose above the murmurs. "Hey, old man," he called out, his tone mocking. "Did you lose your walker? Or are you waiting for someone to carry you home?" A few passengers glanced over, their expressions a mix of discomfort and unease. Samuel remained still, his gaze fixed on the world beyond the glass. If he heard the taunt, he gave no indication. But his silence wasn't submission. It was something far deeper, something the boys and perhaps everyone on the bus were about to understand. Brian leaned back into his seat, laughing as if his words had won him a victory. The laughter of his friends echoed, bouncing off the bus walls like pebbles skipping across still water. Samuel remained still, his fingers lightly gripping his cane, his eyes focused on the passing cityscape, as though the boy's words were carried off with the breeze outside. "Come on, Grandpa," Brian jeered again, louder this time. "What's the matter? Too good to talk to us." His grin widened, a display of youth's arrogant confidence. Samuel turned his head ever so slightly, his weathered face calm and unreadable. His gaze, however, landed on Brian, steady and deliberate. It was the kind of look that could silence a crowded room, not with anger or judgment, but with a depth of knowing. The boy faltered under the weight of it. For a moment he seemed unsure, but his pride pushed him forward. "What's the big deal? You gonna knight me with that cane, King Arthur?" he mocked, though his voice carried less bravado than before. Across the aisle, a young woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, stealing glances at the scene. A man in a gray suit flipped his newspaper, his hands betraying a faint tremor. No one spoke. The silence from the passengers became almost oppressive, a collective decision to remain uninvolved. Brian's smirk faltered, but he pushed harder. "You think you're too good for us? Say something." His voice cracked, frustration beginning to replace the earlier cockiness. Samuel shifted slightly in his seat, leaning forward just enough to rest both hands on his cane. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, cutting through the air like a slow river carving its path through stone. "Respect," he said, his tone carrying the weight of decades. "It's a lesson you should learn early, saves you trouble later." The bus grew silent. The teenagers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. Brian's smirk faded entirely, replaced by a flicker of confusion and embarrassment. Samuel's gaze didn't waver. "You think strength is in loud words and mockery?" he continued, his voice calm but firm. "You don't know what strength looks like. Not yet." And with that, the balance in the air shifted. Brian's bravado wavered, but his pride demanded he push on. "Oh yeah?" he snapped, his voice louder than before, tinged with the defensiveness of someone unsure of their ground. "What do you know about strength, old man? All you've got is that cane and a bunch of stories nobody cares about." Samuel remained seated, his hands still resting on his cane, his posture unyielding. His eyes, though, told another story, a glimpse into a depth that none of the boys could comprehend. He straightened slightly, his voice calm but sharper now. "I know more about strength than you'll ever learn shouting on a bus." The tension thickened, pressing on everyone in the cramped space. The young woman across the aisle bit her lip, her fingers fidgeting with her phone. A man in the back adjusted his headphones, his eyes darting nervously toward the front. Still, no one spoke up. The silence from the passengers was deafening, a wall of inaction that only emboldened Brian further. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brian shot back, stepping forward, his movements more hesitant than before. "You think you're better than me?" Samuel let out a long breath, the kind that carried years of weight. "It means," he said evenly, "I've been where you think you'll never go. I've faced things you can't imagine, and I came out the other side." The bus hit a pothole, jolting everyone slightly, but Samuel didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze remained locked on Brian, steady and unrelenting. "Do you know what it's like to watch friends fall beside you? To carry their memory with you every day, knowing you lived because they didn't?" Brian blinked, his confidence cracking under the weight of Samuel's words. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter now a distant memory. Samuel leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but commanding. "Strength isn't in how loud you are. It's in how you carry yourself when everything around you falls apart. And from where I'm sitting, you're just a boy trying to fill shoes too big for him." Brian took a step back, his face flushing with something that looked like shame. The bus rattled on, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Samuel leaned back in his seat, his expression unchanged, his words lingering like a thundercloud ready to break. The bus lurched forward, the hum of its engine the only sound as tension wrapped itself tightly around the passengers. Brian stood frozen, his bravado slipping like water through his fingers. His friends were quiet now, their earlier amusement replaced by unease. The power dynamic in the small, confined space had shifted entirely. "You think this is strength?" Samuel asked, his voice calm, yet every word carried the weight of conviction. He gestured with a slight movement of his hand, encompassing Brian's swagger and mockery. "Strength isn't making noise. Strength is knowing when to speak and when to listen." Brian's shoulders stiffened. "You don't know me," he mumbled, his tone defensive but weaker than before. "You don't know anything about what I've been through." Samuel's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not amused but understanding. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I know this, the louder someone talks, the more they're trying to hide. And son, you're yelling." A ripple of quiet acknowledgement passed through the bus. Across the aisle, the young woman who had been glued to her phone now looked up, her expression a mix of curiosity and admiration. The man in the middle row nodded almost imperceptibly, his face betraying approval he didn't voice. Brian's friends shuffled awkwardly, one of them whispering, "Man, let it go." But Brian stayed rooted, the flush of embarrassment deepening on his face. His pride fought to keep him standing, even as Samuel's words dismantled the flimsy foundation of his bravado. Samuel straightened, leaning more comfortably into his seat. "Let me tell you something about respect," he said, his voice resonating in the heavy air. "It's not just about how you treat others. It's about how you see yourself. When you respect who you are, truly respect it, you don't need to tear someone else down to feel tall." The bus jolted again as it stopped at a red light. Brian looked away, his jaw tightening. For a fleeting moment his defiance flickered, but it wasn't anger in his expression. It was doubt. The words had reached him, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. As the light turned green and the bus moved on, the silence among the passengers spoke volumes. A lesson was unfolding, not just for Brian, but for everyone on board. The bus rumbled on, its passengers gripped by the quiet storm unfolding in front of them. Brian slumped back into his seat, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his internal struggle. His friends whispered among themselves, their laughter long gone. Across the aisle, the young woman watched silently, her phone forgotten in her lap. Everyone was waiting, unsure of what, but certain they were witnessing something important. Samuel sat still, his cane resting across his knees. For a long moment he gazed out of the window, his expression distant, as if the city streets outside had faded into another world entirely. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memories far older than anyone on the bus could imagine. "You think I'm just an old man with a cane," he began, his tone measured, unhurried. "And maybe that's what you see. But this cane isn't just a piece of wood. It's a reminder of the battles I've fought, the ones that left scars you can't see." Brian glanced up, his bravado giving way to reluctant curiosity. "What battles?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Samuel didn't answer right away. He shifted slightly, his hands brushing the worn wood of the cane. 40 years ago," he said, "I was a young man like you. Thought I was invincible. Thought the world owed me something. Then they sent me to Vietnam." The mention of the war silenced even the soft murmurs of the other passengers. A man in the back straightened, his expression somber. The young woman leaned forward slightly, her attention fully captured. Samuel's voice dropped lower, the edges of his words sharp with memory. "I saw things no one should ever have to see. I carried brothers out of the jungle who didn't make it home. I survived things I didn't think a person could survive. And when I came back, I wasn't the same boy who left." Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting to his friends, but they were quiet now, their faces turned away. Samuel's eyes locked onto Brian's. "The battles I fought didn't end when the war did. They followed me home. They still do. But I learned something, kid. Strength isn't in how hard you can hit or how loud you can shout. It's in how you carry what life puts on your shoulders, and whether you let it break you." The bus jolted over a pothole, but no one seemed to notice. Every passenger was transfixed by Samuel's words, by the quiet power in his voice. Even Brian couldn't meet his gaze anymore. He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting nervously. Samuel leaned back, his grip on the cane loosening. "You think you're strong because you can talk big. But strength, real strength, means carrying the weight of the world and not letting it crush you." The air in the bus was thick with unspoken understanding, the kind of shared silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. The hum of the bus engine was the only sound as Samuel's words settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Brian stared at his hands, his earlier bravado reduced to a flicker of uncertainty. His friends, once so eager to laugh and jeer, sat still, their expressions shadowed by guilt and unease. Samuel turned his gaze back to the window, his reflection faint in the glass. "You remind me of a boy I once knew," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of both pain and understanding. Brian glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Who?" he asked hesitantly. Samuel didn't look at him. "A soldier I served with. He was loud, cocky, always trying to prove something to someone, thought he was untouchable, until the day he wasn't." His voice grew quieter, tinged with an old sadness. "He made a mistake in the field, a simple one, but it cost him his life. He was just a kid, like you, and he never got the chance to grow past his foolishness." The bus hit another bump, but no one flinched. The weight of Samuel's story had tethered everyone to their seats, their attention rapt. "I see him sometimes," Samuel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "In the faces of young men like you, men who think the world owes them something, who think respect is just a word instead of something earned. He turned his head then, his eyes locking onto Brian. "But here's the truth, kid. The world doesn't owe you a damn thing. And if you don't learn respect, real respect, you'll find out the hard way, just like he did." Brian's face reddened, not with anger this time, but with shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. The words caught somewhere between his pride and his guilt. One of his friends finally broke the silence. "We're sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel nodded slightly, his expression softening. "Apology accepted," he said, though his tone carried more wisdom than forgiveness. "But words are just the start. What matters is what you do after them." The bus began to slow as it approached the next stop. Samuel shifted in his seat, gripping his cane as he prepared to stand. His presence, though quiet, filled the space, lingering in the hearts and minds of everyone on board. The lesson wasn't finished yet, but it was beginning to take root. The bus hissed to a stop at the next corner, its brakes squealing softly as Samuel rose to his feet. He straightened his jacket, his movements deliberate, every motion infused with quiet dignity. The passengers watched in silence, their eyes following him as he made his way to the door. Before stepping off, Samuel paused and turned to face the bus. His gaze swept over everyone. Brian and his friends, the young woman with the phone, the man with the newspaper. When he spoke, his voice was calm, yet carried the weight of something timeless. "Kindness and respect cost you nothing," he said, addressing the bus as a whole, yet speaking directly to each person. "But withholding them can cost you everything. Life isn't about how loud you can shout or how much you can take. It's about what you give back, and how you carry the weight of others when they can't carry it themselves." The door hissed open, and Samuel stepped onto the curb. His gait was steady, his cane tapping softly against the concrete as he disappeared into the crowd outside. Inside the bus, the silence was palpable. The passengers exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful, some even ashamed. Brian sat rigid in his seat, staring blankly at the floor. His friends avoided looking at one another. Their earlier confidence crumbled into reflection. Across the aisle, the young woman let out a soft breath, as though she had been holding it the entire time. The man with the newspaper folded it neatly and placed it on his lap, his hands clasped tightly as he stared into the middle distance. As the bus pulled away, the tension that had gripped its passengers began to ease, replaced by something quieter, deeper. It wasn't just the teenagers who had learned something that day. It was everyone on board. Brian finally looked up, his expression conflicted. He turned to his friends, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we shouldn't, do stuff like that anymore." One of them nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, maybe." The bus continued its journey, the rhythm of its wheels a steady backdrop to the passengers' thoughts. What had started as a typical ride had become a moment of reckoning, a lesson not easily forgotten. Outside, Samuel Reed walked on, his figure growing smaller in the distance. His presence lingered in the bus, not as a memory of confrontation, but as a testament to quiet strength and dignity. And as the city moved on, each person who had been there carried a piece of that lesson with them, a reminder of the weight of respect and the power of kindness. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.